Russell Warne is a psychology researcher with the U.S. Army and formerly a professor of psychology at Utah Valley University. His book is In the Know, Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence. We spoke in May 2024.
How would you define little g general intelligence?
So G is a statistical abstraction. You identify it with a statistical procedure called factor analysis. And that's why it's written as a little g and italicized, because that's how we write statistical abbreviations. You think of Cohen's D, the D is little and italicized, a p-value, the p is little and italicized. Well, G is a statistical result, a statistical abstraction. So all it is the shared variance across a bunch of different scores. Usually in this case, those scores are subtests on an intelligence battery. So all G is just the shared variance. Then the question is, well, what does that mean? Why do we care? That shared variance seems to be measuring this general cognitive capacity to do a bunch of different tasks, whether it's memorize a short list of words and then repeat it later, or solve a visual problem. Whatever those 2, 3, 5, 15 different tasks have in common, that's identified with G. And what's causing that variance is that common problem solving ability that people use for every one of those tasks. What's that problem solving ability? Well, I call it intelligence.
Do you think the kind of creativity that we have that the AI does not have, do you think that's very uniquely human, or do you think there's something like that in other animals?
I don't think that there's a global creativity the way that there's a global intelligence. I think creativity is very discipline bound. Creative novelists like Stephen King is not creative in physics. I think it's very discipline specific, and the more similar two disciplines are, the more transfer there can be. But if you're talking about idea generation, if you're talking about innovative ways to problem solve, I think that other animals can find those solutions. The question then is, can those solutions be culturally transmitted? And it seems like in some primates and some birds, the answer might be yes, or in some species definitely is yes. Because to be creative, it's not just solving a problem or creating a product that's innovative and original. It also has to be valued by your community. And that requires a species to be able to be coherent enough and have a common enough culture and communication base that, hey, this organism's doing X, that's good, and I can now imitate it and do X also. Because if your community doesn't recognize the value of what you're doing, then it's not going to be seen as a contribution that goes above and beyond what we already have. So I think that if you're very generous, yes, for some species, for some tasks, but I don't see elephants sitting around and sculpting. I think innovative ideas and solutions are a lot more difficult for other species because we've evolved a lot of cognitive flexibility that other species hadn't. And that's why when you get like, oh, look, we trained this monkey to paint, or, this elephant can paint this or that, the animal might have the brush and be swiping across the canvas. It's not being creative though, because its fellow species members don't see what that animal's doing as being valuable and aren't imitating it and trying to capitalize on that.
I was just imagining like a really primitive version of art might have been drawing in the sand, like drawing a map of this is where we are, and there's antelope over here, and how that just seems probably beyond any animal to have like a symbolic representation.
Yeah, creating art, and we call that the art bias. A lot of people think of creativity as being synonymous with producing artworks. No, you can be creative in other fields. In fact, there's some fields where it's bad to be creative. Like, have you ever heard of creative accounting? That usually gets people sent to jail.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, if you consider creating art, I'm not aware of any evidence whatsoever that any other species has created art for art's sake. Maybe there's some Neanderthal or Homo erectus that possibly has, and I'm not aware of that. But as far as living species goes, I'm not aware of any non-human animal that creates art for art's sake. But if you see creativity as coming up with novel ideas that advance, that solve problems, or that advance a discipline, or advance an organism's ability to have some sort of advantage, whether it's as simple as the aesthetic advantage of having a nicely decorated room, or a creative way to lure prey into a trap. I think that yes, there are some species that do that.
And at the level of transfer learning or cultural transmission, it seems like language is the game. We have complex language that allows us to share that with other people.
For humans, yes, not other animals necessarily. There is cultural transmission in other species without there being language.
Monkey see, monkey do, kind of.
Yeah, monkey. Yeah, that's actually, yes. I mean, literally, monkey see, monkey do. Different populations of monkeys have different ways of grooming one another, and those seem to be culturally transmitted by literally monkey see, monkey do. And we've seen ways that other animals adopt human behaviors or human things. We see that sometimes in birds adopting human objects for decorating nests, and then that will spread among other birds. And so we can even have some sort of cross species cultural transmission through objects, but humans seem to be the only ones that do it through language.
If you think about your earliest memories, they probably came after language. I'm curious, what is your earliest memory in life? And also, do you think that's a coincidence of the development that we get language and persistent memory, or is there maybe a connection?
Well, my earliest memory is being roughly 3 years old and playing a game in the church nursery. But I don't know how much, and it's an image, by the way, not, I can verbalize and describe it, but I remember it as an image. I don't know, because most people, babies start to understand simple commands and their name at about 5 to 8 months or so. And then most children speak their first word at about 11 to 13 months. Most people don't have a memory before 3 years. So I don't know how much of it is just the fact that the lasting memory almost always comes after language. And I don't know how much of it is that language creates memory. And I'm not sure we can answer it, since in humans, language seems to precede permanent memories by years. So I don't know.
Are there any ways of testing long-term planning?
Oh yeah. Have people set a goal that takes years to accomplish and see how well they accomplish it, and discover the reasons why they haven't.
Is it a primitive version of testing that in younger kids? Like how far into the future can they plan?
A little bit. You might have heard of the marshmallow test, which
Sure.
has some pluses and minuses. It's hard to test something like that in a standardized format, because how long term are you talking about? Are you talking about a year, 2 years, 5 years? What I want, and what I'm willing to devote resources and time into in the next year, might be very different from what you're willing to devote resources and time into. That doesn't mean that if I accomplish my goal and you accomplish your goal, and my goal is better, quote unquote, that I'm better at long-term planning. I mean, I'm a big fan of intelligence testing. Yeah, I'm a big fan of testing in general. I went to graduate school to learn about it. I'm also aware of the limitations, and really long-term behaviors these short-term tests are bad at measuring them. We try to get around that by saying, well, if you can plan and successfully complete this task that requires concentration and goal setting and everything for 15 minutes, then you can probably are more likely to fulfill a goal that takes 6 months to complete. That's a little bit of a cop out. Oh, the short-term thing's just as good as the long-term thing. I'm not sure I believe that.
What is innate knowledge, and do we know if that looks different in the brain than learned knowledge?
There are certain things that humans are hardwired to know or to do, and we're not the only species like this. Humans do seem to have an intuitive understanding of basic physics. And we see this a lot with the infancy research. If you set it up so there's an illusion that an object seems to be passing through another solid object, babies will stare at that longer, almost as if they're very surprised that this happened. No, a car should not pass through a block like that. And so there does seem to be some innate things. And we get what's innate, what's not a lot in either cross-cultural research or research on infants. Babies in their first 12 hours are more interested in a picture of a normal face than a face where the eyes and nose and mouth have been rearranged Picasso style. And that seems to tell us that we've been innately wired to be interested in faces when we're born, which makes sense. Humans are born and there's other humans around, at least the mom, if no one else. And we're not the only species like this. Ducks and some other birds imprint, and they'll treat the first large moving object that they see after a couple hours after hatching as being their mother, because usually that is their mother. Humans and other animals can also learn stuff that they weren't born knowing. I'm not a neuroscience expert. I'm not aware of what this looks like in an fMRI or PET scan or whatever. And it would be really hard to do that. In an MRI machine, you have to hold very perfectly still for a long time. It's probably not a good idea to try to stick a baby in an MRI machine if you don't have to. You pretty much will have to strap them down, and I don't want to do that to a child.
And technology is changing our ability to have high resolution information about timing and where stuff is happening in the brain. Is there anything in that field that you're excited about for the future?
The brain imaging leaps and bounds that happen just are amazing. And I'm really liking this thing that plots, what's it called? It's called something like diffusion something. I really like how it plots white matter tracts, because I think that white matter has been understudied compared to gray matter in the brain. There's this technology that's become more widespread in the past about 10 or 15 years that maps out the anatomical connections of one area of the brain to another, maps out these white matter tracts, and it's pretty cool. It's not my area of expertise though, but I still think it's cool.
Sure. How about on the topic of memory experts and savants?
Savants are really interesting. You can't always generalize about an unusual organism to the rest of the species, but they do teach us some important things. And I think knowing the boundaries between what savants can and can't do is very illuminating, and it tells us a lot about a typically developing person's abilities. Some savants can do some really amazing things, but they're not good at creativity. They're not good at doing new things. And the gentleman that Rayman was based on, he passed away several years ago. He lived in Salt Lake City, and I lived in Utah before I recently moved here. And his name is Kim Peek. He was a local celebrity there in Utah. Mr. Peek had an extraordinary memory. He could memorize the phone book just by reading it once. And he could tell you the phone number of anyone in the phone book that he had read. He could tell you what happened on historical dates and stuff. He's very good at memorizing, but he never used this knowledge to, for example, write a history of the world. That would have been something creative. I don't know how useful it would be, but that would have been, an innovative use of his knowledge. And I'm not criticizing Mr. Peake, but understanding his limitations tells us, okay, innovation requires more than just memory. Creativity requires more than just knowledge. You see this with art savants and music savants. They can imitate a concerto on the piano. They can imitate a drawing. But if you tell them, all right, now compose your own etude, create your own interpretation of such and such historical events, they can't do it.
If you had a young person in front of you who's neurodivergent, what kind of advice would you give them? Maybe they do well on school tests, but they struggle in other areas.
Well, there's a lot of different neurodivergences. There's ADHD, there's autism spectrum. If someone has a mild neurodivergence, I would encourage them to find an occupation that coincides with their neurodivergence. A lot of these people have great passions. Sure, it may be off-putting in a 10-year-old with mild autism spectrum disorder. It might be off-putting to his peers or his parents that all he wants to do is talk about bridges and read about bridges. And when they go on vacation, he has to see a bridge. He doesn't care about anything else we do on vacation. But hey, when you grow up, if you can find something that allows you to either use that passion, that interest, or that allows you to pursue that passion and interest in your spare time, more power to you. Because one thing that distinguishes okay workers from amazing workers is passion and willingness to devote extra time and attention. And if you're obsessed with bridges, you're going to be the best darn engineer, bridge engineer out there. And you're not going to think twice about putting in the extra hours to get ahead, because this is your passion. You love it, you enjoy it. So that'd be what I would recommend, is find an occupation that either capitalizes on your passion or lets you pursue it in your spare time.
I like that. Who is Dallin? I think he was mentioned in your book dedication page.
Backup Dad? Yeah, book. He's my brother. He's my youngest brother. We're really close. When I was writing my book, In the Know, Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence, he would often come visit and handle my kids while I was writing. When I wrote the book, I had 3 kids, and the oldest would have been about 4 or 5. And being able to have another person there to be a father figure when real dad is busy cranking out a book and writing has been very rewarding. I'm very thankful for him, and that's why I dedicated the book to him.
Nice. Very nice. And I really enjoyed your book, by the way. Let me ask you this. This is kind of a specific question, taken from the book. How bad is lead poisoning for IQ? And should municipal water be supplemented with iodine?
So you're talking about 2 different things, lead and iodine. We know that lead poisoning can lower intelligence, lower IQ. And we know that iodine deficiency does the same thing. With lead, lead can be really bad. The good news about lead is that in wealthy countries, the amount of lead that people have in their bodies and their blood is so low that if we were to eliminate it completely, I don't think we would notice the change in IQ. That was not true 50 years ago. In fact, when I was researching that chapter of the book, I was astonished how high some of the lead levels were. And not in like, oh, here's a sample of kids living next to a factory that spews out pollutants 24 hours a day. Like the general population, low amounts of lead in the 1970s are like 3-4 times the level of what get health authorities concerned about today.
Wow.
Oh yeah, it's astonishing. I mean, when you read it, it's like, oh yes, children with low levels of lead below 20 micrograms per deciliter. I'm like, 20? We start getting worried when it's 5 or 8. Like, holy crap, that was low in the 70s.
Wow. And those would be people in their 70s and 80s now?
Yeah, people who were children back then. So yeah, people in their 50s, 60s, early 70s today. Basically my parents' generation. My parents, or people slightly younger than my grandparents. Yeah, the main source of lead at that time was coming from the environment, mostly from leaded gasoline. And when I would teach this to my students, it would just make them dumbfounded. Gasoline doesn't have to have lead in it. It was added to gasoline in the 20s to reduce engine knock, and everyone knew that it was harmful and would send lead out into the air, but they said, oh, well, it'll make our cars run slightly quieter. The United States got rid of lead in gasoline in the 90s, and other countries have followed suit. And that alone has made lead level plummet. Other things, getting rid of lead paint, which also happened in the 70s. Even in older buildings, very few people live in buildings with exposed lead paint in the United States. And so if we were to spend all the time and money to get rid of lead, I don't know that there's much more IQ improvement to do, because our lead levels are already far lower than anyone would have dreamed would be normal 50 years ago. With iodine, no, we don't need to add iodine to the water, at least not in the United States. Most salt is iodized. Iodine's been added to salt, to table salt, for about 100 years. And most Americans get far too much salt in their diet. We don't need more iodine. We already get too much. There are some parts of the world where there's not a lot of iodine in the natural environment, in the water, in the air. Places, Central Asia is a good example of that. There's parts of Africa, parts of South America like that. Those places would benefit from iodine supplements, and there are charities where you can donate to provide iodine to children with a deficiency to try to prevent a mental disability. And those are very effective charities. Iodine's cheap. You can iodize a whole package of salt for just a couple pennies. And so donating even $10 to a charity like that can iodize enough salt or provide enough iodine tablets to an entire town, every child in an entire town, and prevent them from having an intellectual disability. They're very effective charities. But we don't need that in the US. Most other developed countries are similar. They get too much iodized salt. Please don't add more.
What do you think about the intelligence of American political leaders? What are they uniquely good at?
They're uniquely good at exploiting I say this as someone who hates both major parties in the United States. The average congressman or senator is uniquely good at exploiting the irrational fears of their colleagues and their constituents. That's more Machiavellianism than intelligence, though, per se. I know it's really common to look at some politicians saying something stupid or proposing a bad policy and say, oh, what an idiot. I don't think that there's a single person in Congress with an IQ lower than 110 or 115. Same with governors. I would be extraordinarily surprised if you could find one, because you've got to have a brain in your head, and a pretty good one, to convince thousands of people to vote for you and not for the other guy. And running a campaign, even if you have a campaign manager, running a campaign to be able to appear at the events, know what to say, campaign manager, etc., takes some brains. And clearly these people have succeeded in that.
This comes from one of the myths that you dispel. Is intelligence research a threat to equality?
No. I know a lot of people who are concerned about that, but scientific progress is just a matter of uncovering truth. There's certain types of equality, and I go into this in the book. There's moral equality, there's political equality, there's equality of outcomes. I fervently believe that we will be more successful in devising policies that match our social goals if those policies are based on reality and truth and not on incorrect ideas or wishful thinking. And so you want equality of outcomes or you want some other type of equality, more power to you. Those can be very good social and moral goals. Base them on truth and you'll be more likely to get there. You can use intelligence research for that. And I give some examples in the book.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes from the book was just about inalienable rights and that society should encourage compassion and less judgment for vulnerable members. And that was kind of, recognizing differences in intelligence among individuals or studying that can be a way to encourage compassion and
yes, I agree. A lot of people live in a cognitive bubble. They have neighbors and friends and coworkers who probably have an IQ about within 10 points of their own. And my readers, they're smart. You wouldn't read a science book if you weren't interested in science and had, a couple of IQ points more than average. If you don't have someone in your life, an adult in your life with an IQ below 80, you have no idea how hard that life is and how different it is for them. I think there's a lot of this blindness among the elites. They think that everyone thinks and acts like them or could. And no, there are some people who struggle to understand why you have to show up to work on time for every shift you're scheduled for. And we should devise policies that allow that bottom 10, 20% of the population to flourish as much as they can. Because a lot of laws we pass, a lot of policies we create are done so without lower IQ individuals' needs in mind. A really good example is the tax code. It's really hard for someone with an IQ of 75 to understand why you might want to file your taxes, and if the government's been taking taxes out of my salary, out of my paycheck all year, they've been taking that money. Why do I want to file? Then, have you ever tried to do your taxes without software? Oh my gosh, I have a PhD. And the first time I tried to do it, it took me about 2.5 evenings. That was all I did. And I still probably messed up. Simplifying the tax code and making it so you don't have to do anything extra would be a great boon to that bottom 10, 20% of the population.
Definitely agree with you on that. If they know how much money I owe them, why can't they just tell me? One more question. What question are you most interested in answering?
About intelligence?
Sure. Yeah, in your career.
There are a couple. Some of them I don't have the expertise to be able to answer or even get any progress on that. And I'm relying on colleagues, some of whom are much smarter than I am, to find those answers. As far as ones that I can contribute to, I am extremely interested in cross-cultural measures of intelligence. I published an article about 5 years ago in Psychological Bulletin where I found archival data from non-Western countries, from developing nations, and I did factor analysis, and over 95% of the data sets produced a general G factor. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the G we found in Kenya is the same as the G we found in Nepal. But in these countries, which I picked because they were the least likely to have a Western style result, because they were economically developing and they were non-Western, I still found a Western-like result in over 95%. And that tells me that probably this general cognitive ability is probably universal among humans. And there's some evidence saying it's probably universal among mammals and maybe even some other animals. And so, okay, there is this universal ability, But that does not mean the manifestations are universal. The way that American adults show their intelligence may be very different from the way that children in Zambia do. And that may be very different from the way that women in Cambodia show their intelligence. And so I'm very interested in finding tasks that work across multiple cultures so that we can understand, okay, is the Cambodian G the same as the American G? Cross-cultural research is very difficult to do. I wish I had more resources to do it in, but I am trying to make progress on that. We'll see.
And that might open the doors to some travel too, which would be cool. It sounds like.
Yeah, it'd be cool to do some traveling. I've made progress with archival data, but I would, and that's one of the things I've done with some test development. I have a colleague that wants to work with me in developing a test in his country, and so I think we can make some progress, but it's slow.
Good deal. Russell, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for taking time to talk today. I loved your book. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.
Russell Warne's book is In the Know, and his website is russellwarne.com. Thank you for listening.